Now all this happens in a small, quiet village named Savona, situated in central Steuben County, right off what used to be State Route 17, now known as Interstate 86. It was a place where residents knew each other and where life had a gentle, familiar rhythm. In this village lived a little boy named Derrick, who was just 4 years old. He was the kind of kid that made everyone smile, full of energy and curiosity. Parents Dale and Derrick Robie still live there today, holding on to the memories of their boy. Derrick was the eldest of 2 children and had this spark in him that everyone noticed. He loved being outside, especially when he got to go to the nearby park. It was just a block away from his house on the same side of the street, so it was simple for him to wander down there whenever he wanted to join in on the fun and games. The park, his little slice of freedom, where he could run around, play, and be the lively, joyful kid that he was. But just down the road in the same village lived another boy, 13-year-old Eric Smith. Now, Eric's life was nothing like Derrick's. He didn't have that same brightness in his world. You see, Eric had been through some tough times, really tough. His classmates picked on him constantly. They made fun of his short ears, his glasses, and his bright red hair. They didn't see the person behind those things, just the things they could use to hurt him. And they did hurt him over and over again, until all that pain and anger built up inside him like a pressure cooker ready to blow. Eric didn't have many ways to deal with all that hurt. He felt alone, misunderstood, and angry. That anger grew over the years, fed by every cruel word and every laugh at his expense. He wanted to find a way to let it out and make someone feel the way he felt. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was rage, and it was looking for a target. That's when Derrick came into the picture. On that fateful day, things took a tragic turn on the morning of August 2nd, 1993. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. 4-year-old Derrick was up and ready to head to the park, just like he always did. But that morning was a little different. Now, Doreen usually kept a close eye on Derrick whenever he went to the park. It was just a short trip down the street from their house in Savona, New York. The park was only a block away, and Doreen had always been there to watch him. But that day, Derrick's baby brother was crying and needed her attention. Her hands were full, so she decided it would be okay to let Derrick make the short walk on his own. She trusted the safety of their small town. Savona wasn't a place where you worried about your kids. With only about 917 people living there, everyone knew each other, and it felt like nothing terrible could ever happen. But that morning, something terrible was lurking just around the corner. Derrick gave his mom, Doreen, a final kiss goodbye and told her, "I love you, Mom. I'll go by myself." It was the first time he would walk to the park alone. Doreen watched as Derrick, full of confidence and excitement, headed off to the park. She didn't think twice about it. Why would she? It was a quiet town, and the park was just down the street.
Wish this on anyone. A wonderful child, and we miss him terribly.
Now, that morning, Eric had been kicked out of the local day camp for causing trouble. He was already boiling with anger when he spotted Derrick walking alone. Eric's anger was like a ticking time bomb, and on that morning, it exploded. When he saw Derrick, an innocent little boy who had nothing to do with Eric's pain, something inside him snapped. He saw Derrick as an outlet for all his pent-up rage and frustration. It didn't matter that Derrick was just a child, content and carefree, on his way to enjoy a day at the park. Derrick was there at the wrong time for Eric, and he became the target for all the anger Eric had been carrying for years. Eric, filled with rage, decided to take out all his frustrations on Derrick. It wasn't about Derrick, really. It was about everything Eric had gone through, all the bullying, all the hurt. But poor Derrick, who just wanted to play and have fun, became the tragic victim of Eric's pain. Eric rode past Derrick at first, but then he circled back around. He saw that Derrick was alone, and that gave him a twisted sense of power. Eric knew he could manipulate the situation, so he did what he had done before. He used his tricks. He told Derrick he knew a faster way to get to the park, a shortcut that would get him there quicker. Derrick believed him because he was a trusting 4-year-old. Why wouldn't he? In his mind, this was just another kid trying to help. But Eric had no intention of helping Derrick. Instead, he led Derrick away from the safety of the park and into an empty field hidden by large bushes. No one could see them there, allowing Eric to carry out his sinister plan uninterrupted. Eric lured Derrick deeper into the wooded area, continuing to promise him that this was the way to the park. But there was no park at the end of this path, only the darkness of Eric's intentions. Once they were far enough from anyone who might hear, Eric turned on Derrick. He strangled the little boy until he lost consciousness, and then did something even more horrifying. He picked up a large rock and dropped it on Derrick's head. But Eric's cruelty didn't stop there. He took a small stick and hurt Derrick in a way that's too terrible to describe, a way no child should ever suffer. And then, as if to add another layer of horror to what he had done, Eric took the Kool-Aid from Derrick's lunchbox and poured it into the boy's open wounds. It was a final act of cruelty, one that showed just how twisted Eric's mind had become. Back at home, Doreen's worry grew as the minutes ticked by. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Also, just after little Derrick left home, the sky started to change. Storm clouds rolled in, and the rain began to fall. Derrick's mom, Doreen, felt a gnawing sense of dread in her gut. It was the kind of feeling only a mother knows, a deep worry that something just wasn't right. Around 11 a.m., she
says, "I love you, Mom," and he went hopping off the sidewalk.
to make sure he had made it there safely. But when she arrived, her worst fear came true. Derrick was nowhere to be found. He had never made it to the park, and Doreen's heart sank. She immediately called the authorities. The search for Derrick began, and nearly 5 hours later, searchers made a grim discovery. In a small patch of woods near the park, they found Derrick's lifeless body. The scene was heartbreaking. A banana from Derrick's lunch bag lay smashed nearby, and the Kool-Aid, which should have been a treat for a happy day at the park, was poured into his wounds. Eric had not only intercepted Derrick on his way to the park, but had lured him into that secluded area, where he unleashed his full rage on the innocent child. What started as a normal day in a quiet town of Savona had turned into a nightmare. The innocence of a little boy was stolen by the anger of another, and a community that once felt safe and close-knit was shattered by the horror of what had happened. It was a day that would never be forgotten, a day when the darkness in one boy's heart took away the light in another's life forever. So after that awful discovery of Derrick's body, the small town of Savona was gripped by fear and confusion. Savona, being close to a major highway, led people to speculate that Derrick had been killed by some drifter just passing through. It was a comforting thought in a way, thinking that such evil could only come from outside, from a stranger who didn't belong in their tight-knit community. But that assumption would soon be shattered. In the days that followed Derrick's death, the town turned into a hotbed of suspicion. A massive manhunt kicked off, with police and investigators combing through every lead they could find. They were on the lookout for someone, anyone who might have come into town and done this terrible thing. Parents kept their kids close, too scared to let them out of their sight. The idea that the killer was someone local was too much to hear. They couldn't fathom the thought that anyone from their community could have harmed Derrick, the little boy who everyone knew and loved. Derrick was the heart of Savona, the one they all called the unofficial mayor, the happy child who would sit on the corner, greeting everyone with a smile. But as the investigation deepened, the focus of the search started to shift. The police weren't finding any clues pointing to an outsider. and the fear of an unknown drifter began to wane. That's when they started looking closer to home, closer to the people they all knew. And that's when the police talked to a local boy named Eric Smith. Eric was just 13 years old, and he seemed like any other kid in the neighborhood, but there was something about his story that caught the investigators' attention. Eric told them that he had been riding his bike near the area where Derrick's body was found. He said he had seen Derrick cross the street around the time of the murder. Eric was even able to describe what Derrick was wearing that day, down to the details of his t-shirt and lunch bag. It seemed like Eric might have seen something important, maybe something that could help solve the case. The investigators listened carefully to Eric's story. One of them thought Eric might have witnessed something related to the murder, something he didn't fully understand. But as they dug deeper, the story started to unravel. On August 6, 1993, just a few days after Derrick's death,
said goodbye to his mom basically at this back door, and then he came by himself out to the sidewalk.
They videotaped Derrick as he reenacted that moment, riding his bike just as he had described. But something didn't add up. From the distance Eric claimed he was, he couldn't have seen all those details as clearly as he had described them. The investigators quickly realized that Eric knew more than he was letting on. Eric's family, who had stood by him, also began to feel uneasy. They couldn't deny the holes in his story. The police were beginning to suspect him, but at this point, they have no proof. Just a few days later, the truth finally came to light in the most heartbreaking way. People around Eric Smith, especially those close to his family, started to notice something wasn't right with him. One person who really started to worry was a family friend named Marlene Heskell. Marlene had known Eric for a while, and something about his behavior after Eric's death just didn't sit right with her. One night, Eric asked her a question. He wanted to know what would happen if it turned out that the killer was a kid. Marlene, trying to keep things light, said that if it was a kid, they'd probably need some serious psychiatric help. Eric just nodded and said, "Oh, okay," and walked away. But that question stuck with Marlene. She knew Eric had been at the same park near where Derrick was found, and suddenly everything started to click. She began to wonder if Eric knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he had seen something, or worse, maybe he was involved. As the days passed, Eric's family couldn't ignore the signs either. They knew something was weighing heavily on him, and they begged him to tell them what he knew. Finally, on August 8, 1993, Eric couldn't hold it in any longer. In a moment that would change their lives forever, he broke down in front of his family. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. I killed that little boy," he confessed. Eric's confession didn't just stay within the family. He eventually told law enforcement everything, detailing how he lured Derrick into that wooded area and took his life. It was a confession that stunned everyone who knew Eric, and it was just the beginning of a wave of shock that would sweep across the entire country. The very next day, on August 9, 1993, the authorities made it official. They announced that Eric Smith had been arrested for the murder of Derrick Robie. The news spread like wildfire. Suddenly, this small, quiet town of Savona was thrust into the national spotlight. People couldn't believe it. How could a 13-year-old boy, someone who looked so innocent, commit such a brutal and senseless crime? It didn't make sense, and yet it was true. So after that shocking confession and arrest, the legal wheels began to turn, leading to a moment that would define Eric Smith's fate. As Eric's case moved forward, his defense team began to build their argument. They didn't just focus on what happened on that tragic day. They delved deep into Eric's life, trying to explain how a boy so young could commit such a horrifying act. They brought up the bullying that Eric endured for years, how his classmates tormented him for his appearance, his red hair, and his glasses. However, bullying was only one part of their defense. The defense also introduced the idea that Eric suffered from something called intermittent explosive disorder, a condition where a person has sudden and intense outbursts of anger. They argued that his disorder made it challenging for Eric to control his emotions, leading to violent reactions that he couldn't manage. But the most surprising part of the defense came when they started talking about Eric's mother, Tammy. Even before Tammy became pregnant with Eric, doctors prescribed her the medication Tridione for her epilepsy. The problem was that Tridione was extremely dangerous for an unborn baby, yet Tammy continued to take it during her pregnancy with Eric. The defense argued that this medication caused Eric to be born with physical deformities and developmental delays. They said these issues,
inside himself, from whatever sources produce anger, he builds up rage. And it doesn't express itself, and then the rage explodes.
Despite the defense's efforts to paint Eric as a troubled and misunderstood boy who didn't fully grasp what he was doing, the prosecution pushed back hard. They argued that Eric knew exactly what he was doing when he took Derrick's life. They said that, regardless of his struggles, Eric understood that what he did was wrong and that he should be held responsible for his actions. A year after Derrick's murder, in August 1994, the trial began. Eric's defense attorney argued that Eric's mental issues, especially his rage disorder, meant that he shouldn't be held criminally responsible. They brought up his history of speech problems, his temper tantrums as a toddler, and how he had been bullied and held back in school. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They insisted that Eric's mental state didn't excuse what he did, that he knew right from wrong, and that he should face the consequences. On August 16, 1994, after hours of intense deliberation,
So you find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree?
Yes.
Rick Smith guilty of second-degree murder for killing Derrick Robie. The jury accepted the prosecutor's argument that Eric wasn't suffering from any extreme mental disorder that controlled his actions that day. He knew what he was doing, and he was guilty. Just a few months later, on November 7, 1994, the judge handed down Eric's sentence. He was given the maximum punishment, 9 years to live. That moment sealed Eric's future. He would spend his time in a juvenile detention facility until he turned 21. After that, he would be transferred to an adult prison to continue serving his sentence. So after that sentencing, Eric Smith began serving his time, but the story was far from over. On June 11, 2002, Eric, now a young man at 22, faced his first parole hearing. This was his first chance to possibly leave prison, but it didn't go as he might have hoped. The parole board took a long look at him and noted that he still seemed to show little remorse for what he had done to Derrick Robie. They weren't convinced that he had truly changed, so they denied his request for parole. The door.
He never lived a full life because of me.
After that, Eric would get another chance, but the outcome wasn't likely to change easily. 2 years later, on June 8, 2004, Eric tried again. By then, he was 24 years old, and once more, the parole board said no. But something different happened that year. Eric decided to speak out publicly for the first time. He read a statement in front of the cameras for the TV show 48 Hours. In this statement, he apologized, acknowledging the terrible loss he had caused the Robie family. He spoke about the bullying he endured as a child and how it had pushed him to shut down his feelings. Eric believed that the constant teasing and verbal abuse led him to lash out in the most violent way possible against someone who had nothing to do with his pain. Yet, despite his words, the parole board didn't see enough to grant him his freedom. As the years passed, Eric grew older, and the weight of what he had done seemed to hang heavier on him. In December 2009, just before another parole hearing in 2010, Eric spoke out again, this time in an interview with WENY-TV, a CBS News affiliate. By this point, he was nearly 30 years old. In the interview, Eric tried to explain his actions further. He said that his anger on the day of Derrick's murder wasn't really about Derrick at all. Instead, it was aimed at the type of boys who had tormented him for so long.
I want to, get married, raise a family, hold down, a job.
But even with these words, the parole board wasn't swayed, and once again, they denied his release. Years continued to roll by, and Eric had now faced the parole board 10 times without success. But on October 5th, 2021, Eric Smith went before the parole board for the 11th time. This time, his story was a little different. Eric talked about wanting to get a college education. He shared plans to work in electrical installation or carpentry if he ever got out. He also mentioned that he was engaged to a woman studying to be a lawyer, a relationship that had grown over time through letters discussing the juvenile justice system. Eric's life has changed in many ways since that terrible day in 1993. Then, just 2 days later, on October 7th, 2021, the parole board granted Eric Smith's release. They based their decision on several factors, including his clean disciplinary record in prison, a solid plan for what he would do after release, and low scores on his risk assessment. After nearly 3 decades behind bars, Eric Smith was finally given a second chance. On February 1st, 2022, Eric Smith walked out of prison, a free man for the first time in 28 years. But his release didn't come without complications. Eric wouldn't be free from supervision, though he would remain on parole for the rest of his life, carrying the weight of his past actions with him wherever he went. And so, after nearly 3 decades, Eric Smith's story took another turn, leaving behind a community still grappling with the pain of what had happened all those years ago, and a man trying to rebuild his life under the shadow of his own dark past.